Henderson, yes, we have quite a few people who come from Henderson. I'm glad you've joined them. Thank you for being here. So, so I'll talk directly to you for a moment, since there are all these veteran. Yes, we have these seminars every morning of the season, except on Mondays. We are here on Sundays, never on Mondays, because our marching orders are to talk about the plays that were presented the previous day. And so today, the 9 o'clock hour and the rest of the season, 9 o'clock hour, we talk about the plays that were presented on the Engelstadt Theater, as in today, Henry V, we will be talking about. The 10 o'clock hour, we will talk about the play that was in the Randall Theater yesterday, Coconuts. And so that's the way it goes. 10 o'clock hour reserved for plays in the that were in the Randall, and when we open the Ames Theater, that will be at the 10 o'clock hour. 9 o'clock hour, always the Engelstadt shows. A lot of you come over the years. I know you come this time because you get to hear the directors, and they are very gracious to come when they're short of sleep and to come at 9 o'clock to be with us. And so today we have Brian Vaughn, the director of Henry V, with us. Let me tell you a few things about Brian that you probably know, but I love saying it anyway. Brian has been in over 50 productions here at the Utah Shakespeare Festival. He is a graduate of this university and began at the festival in the green shows. Brian is now one of 2 artistic directors here at the festival and has played major roles here in addition to supporting roles. Most recently, if you were here last year, you saw him as Petruchio in our very successful production of Taming of the Shrew. He has also directed here at the festival, directed regionally, directed at Orlando Shakes. He was a company member at Milwaukee Repertory Theater for a number of years, has been our Harold Hill, has been in Into the Woods, he's been Hamlet, Henry V. In fact, this festival has only presented Henry V 3 times. First time in 1983 with Henry Warrenitz, some of you know that name. Second time in 1997 with Don Burrows as Henry V, and then with this gentleman the last time we presented it. But Brian knows the Henry plays so well. Not only has he played Prince Hal and Hotspur, he has directed for the last 3 seasons, counting this one, as we've done the Henry cycle. He directed Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and now The King. And in all 3 of those productions, we had Sam Ashdown, who is now the King, Henry. Also in those 3 productions, Larry Bull, who was Henry IV, and now we have Larry Bull as chorus. So I know you'll probably have lots and lots of questions or comments to ask this man who knows more about the Henry plays than anyone here, I venture to guess. So anyway, welcome, Brian Vaughn. So I'll start off, Brian, by asking you, as you know the play intimately as an actor and have worked on it numerous times as a director, how do you enter the play in terms of how you put the script together and how you decide what to include? Do you look at it more as an actor or as a director, or can you separate those two? And what I don't want to say versions, what additions do you use? What do you use, any of the folio, any of the quarto? Tell us about that.
The answer actually is both. Both. I look at the play both from an acting point of view, which is really about action and objective and getting what you want as the character and what their needs and goals are in the particular scenes and moments in the play. And then from the director, it's also about the visual storytelling that's hopefully going along with that, and that it's coming into the point of view, overall overarching point of view that we want to present for the play. Because this production is sitting inside a sort of cycle of plays, when David Ivers, my co-artistic director colleague, when we decided when we came on board as artistic directors, we decided two initiatives. One of them was to present all of Shakespeare's plays here at the festival, because we actually have not presented all of Shakespeare's plays, and thought that that was kind of ridiculous that we're 55 years old and we've only presented, so many. So that's part of a 12-year cycle of presenting all of Shakespeare's plays. And within that, we also created another initiative, which was to present all of Shakespeare's history plays in chronological order, beginning with King John, and then it will end with Henry VIII. And the purpose for that is really understanding and clarity of the overarching family drama, essentially, that is going on from one generation to the next generation, in Shakespeare's viewpoint, and about what it means to be a king, and the burden that one undertakes and undergoes of position of leadership in England. So this play, in the current cycle, is number 5 of 10. But it's actually the 9th play of the histories that he wrote. So he wrote the Henry VI's first, and then he went back and wrote some of the other plays. So this play, I think, is actually one of the more sound history plays, as far as some of the thematic things, which I'll tap into in a second. But as far as knowing that I was doing Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2, and then this play, Henry V, I knew going in, obviously, that I wanted this sort of serial drama to happen over the course of the plays, that those that had seen Part 1 could get glimpses of that in Part 2, and then, of course, in Henry V. And going into it, the main thing was Hal, or Henry, obviously, the son who inherits the throne from his usurping father, and also the father. So Larry and Sam, I knew right away that I wanted them incorporated in this sort of overarching story, because it's really about them, both for me in telling the story, to know that it's the same actor playing the same part, and also for the audience, that they themselves begin to establish a relationship with these actors within these roles, so that there's greater familiarity and greater clarity of the story. So Larry Bull, actually, who plays the chorus, played Bolingbroke in Richard II, and then he played Henry in Part 1 and Part 2, and now I knew that I wanted that thread of him as the chorus, because it felt to me like he's the cheerleader in the show. He's the guy who's speaking all the positive hope in the play, and to have that coming from the father who believes in the son, as sort of symbolic to me about a king who is on his deathbed, realizes his regrets of not loving his own son and believing in his own son. And so that was kind of an underthread in this play, but I knew that it had great merit and great resonance for us doing it, and especially for Sam, who's obviously playing Hal. And the play, really, for me, is not necessarily a war play. It's a play about conflict, and it's a play about a battle of conscience in doing the right and wrong, and the burden that a king must bear to try to find oneself within the circumstances that are presented to them. The thing that I love that Shakespeare has done and woven so well in the play is that he's also used the theater as a vessel for that to happen with greater resonance, by having a character come out and apologize, basically, and say, bear with us as we present this incredibly epic tale in this really confined space with a lot of raw and limited resources. But he also makes Hal, Henry, an actor. And we see these different facets of this young man trying to embody these roles, which are, a warrior, a politician, a lover, a friend, a governor, a justice of the peace. I mean, all of this stuff that he's trying to be. And I think through the course of the play, he realizes that it's not about becoming something else. It's about tapping into an authentic sense of self and believing in who he is. And that, to me, I think, is the the main thing that I think Shakespeare was doing in writing this particular version of this history play. This play was written in 1599, which was a really, really prolific year for Shakespeare. He wrote Much Ado About Nothing, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, Henry V, As You Like It, not 12, yeah, 12th Night, As You Like It, and Hamlet. At the latter end of 1599, which tells you right there he was. But one thing about those plays is they all really involve the individual contemplating their own self, and especially Hamlet and Henry V. That there's great moments of introspection that becomes about living in the now, and not living in somebody else's shoes or trying to embody another ideal. It's about using your own self, your own sense of who you are within this role. And the climax of the play really, not obviously is the Battle of Agincourt, but before that is the Upon the King's speech that he has the night before the battle, where he gets in touch with the true idea about, it's not about these things we put on ourselves, it's about ourself within those things. And the whole play up to that point is a struggle for him. He just goes forward and gets pushed back. He goes forward and gets pushed back. He gets forward and gets pushed back. And he does a lot of rah-rah or attempted rah-rah, but there's great doubt and uncertainty that is poised through that entire journey. And it's not until that moment where he says, "The day, my friends, and all things stay for me." And that me, I think, is a huge thing in this play about him, that he has a sense of belief in who he is. And then the very next speech that we see with him is the St. Crispin's Day speech, which is probably one of the greatest speeches ever written about humility, and that it's not about one person, but it's about the cumulative efforts of all of us together to overcome great odds. And it becomes a selfless use of rhetoric and language to try to get people to believe in themselves. And that's the first time where people come together in the play. And it comes from him who has a greater understanding of who he is. And then you have this beautiful scene at the end of the play, which is like out of a completely new play. All of a sudden, you're like, why are we in this romantic comedy all of a sudden? But that's a facet of a guy who is like who he is. And the play is no longer in verse, it's in prose at that moment. And those of you that know, or sort of examine some of these plays or read these plays, as an actor or performer, verse really tells you that it's a more formal situation. And when you go to prose, it's a lot more relaxed and a lot more down to earth. And it tells you something going on with the character about their comfortability. And Prince Hal in Henry IV Part 1 does that to great effect in the play, how he bounces between the tavern world in prose, and then he kicks into verse in the court with his father and his brothers and so forth, and uncles. And in this play, the same thing happens. It becomes a dance of two people who don't speak the same language, and yet they have complete and utter understanding of one another. And that creates a union of these two nations, really. And it actually, obviously, I think it's one of the only plays, actually, where there's a little bit of a respite of peace for a considerable amount of time. It ends sort of on an up note. Richard III ends on an up note, sort of, with Richmond also. But the other plays, up to this point, are I took the crown, I'm now the king. And the very next play we have is traitors coming in and factions attacking him. And then the end of that play is we got to go attack somebody else to try to keep this stuff away. And that's the difference between his father and him, is that his father was very afraid and fearful and didn't know how to rule because he didn't know how to bring people in. He kept them away, pushed them away. And I think Hal's journey in this play is taking that sensibility and changing it to try to bring people together, to become a united kingdom.
And even if you haven't seen the Henry IV's Part 1 and 2, in those plays, we see Hal out talking to people as himself and see the private side of him. In Henry V, we see almost always the public side and this role that he's playing. But then Shakespeare puts in those moments with Catherine. And then when the other one is when Henry goes out in to talk to the troops, but he has to disguise himself. He can't be the person that he really thinks he is. And as you were mentioning it, it made me think about how there's still so much a part of him that wants people to know who he is, but he goes in a disguise. And then at the end, when we have that wonderful scene, you say, that seems almost as if it was added on. And then, but then the chorus comes and tells us, but it didn't end well. He lost, his son lost everything, and he dies of, well, he doesn't tell us that the king died of dysentery, but it does end on an unhappy note as well. But you remember the Catherine scene, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I love that scene. It's unlike any other scene written in Shakespeare, really, and especially in a play that's all about going to war and then the repercussions of that. And then all of a sudden you see that played out again, really. It's sort of another war in itself of how a king is trying to overcome the battle of trying to woo a woman and love and embodying that. And he kind of uses similar tactics to try to woo her. And a lot of the time to no avail until he starts speaking from his heart, which is the end, which is about, shall not thou and I compound a boy, half French, half English, that shall go to Constantinople and take the Turk by the beard. That it becomes more than just sitting on the throne. It becomes about unifying bloodline in the play to move forward. And that's also the conflict at the beginning of the play about his own bloodline and his own seek for legitimacy and actually having the right to sit on the throne in the first place.
So I'll ask one more comment or question before I turn it over to the audience. Speaking of women and your casting of a woman as Montjoy, and Montjoy being a woman in the play, would you tell the audience about that? That came up in the last seminar about, traditionally I think that, well, obviously, when these plays were performed, there were no women in them. And that's not the case now, and nor should it be. Well, it could be for different productions, whatever that's as far as someone's taste and whatever. But I knew that I wanted to have more women in it than were scripted, because I think the female voice in this play is actually a very powerful one. And the play is actually about that idea, about this Salic law, which says that no man shall be in heretics of female descent, and that the French themselves are not really holding up that law in the first place. There's great hypocrisy to that notion. So I thought, well, why? Wonder, nothing says that these are gender specific, some of these other roles. What would that be like if I got a more prominent female presence in some of these French scenes? Because I just thought that would be dynamic. And the fact that here's an entire room of men and then two women walk in and they deliver the message for the Dauphin. And they actually, the two characters kind of speak sense in that French court around these completely blinded French men in the play. One, an impetuous young callow youth who's trying to be something he's not, and then a bloodthirsty constable. And then Scrupus sort of bounces back and forth between both of those. And Orleans, there's an overconfidence and overzealousness to the French that we have to play. But Montjoy, especially, is really this voice of peace, and sort of says things in the play that are like, you need to rethink what you're doing here. That if you really look at what's going on, they're stronger, they're mightier than they seem. And I thought that would just be really interesting. And nobody scratches their head when a woman plays a boy or something like that, but they kind of scratch their head when they're like, would they have had a woman in this thing? Well, it's like, well, maybe not historically, but for our purposes, yeah. And for this world that we're creating, that is important to me. And I think actually it makes the play resonate on a new level that is actually quite immediate and quite contemporary. And that, to me, is kind of the goal of presenting these plays, is that these plays have great resonance now, and that there are ways to put them into perspective that could also have
multiple layers of meaning.
Okay, comments from the audience? Yes.
Wait, other microphone.
Other mic.
Oh, sorry. I feel like I'm in coconut.
Two questions. First, simple. Has there been any decision made on future Henry productions if you're going to be directing?
Not sure yet. We will obviously present the Henry VI plays. We're about to announce our season next week, actually, so you can kind of keep an eye on that. But we're not sure who's going to be directing them yet. We will present them. I would like to present them actually in a little bit more. The Henry Sixes are in 3 plays, and within that is also Richard III. So there's kind of 4 that revolve around the War of the Roses. And I just think it would be really cool to either have them in 2 plays that an audience could see the whole thing unfold in one day. They could see an afternoon and an evening where they could get the entire story. But they're really big, and they need adapting and all of that. But they have been done, and for a Shakespeare enthusiast, it's quite thrilling, that notion, I think. But they're also hard. You know, it's a history that's removed from us. They can sometimes fall into the trap of being talking heads and people not really understanding things. And that's sort of the endeavor to try to make the storytelling immediate. Thing is, when you get down to it, it's actually less about politics and more about family drama than anything. It's about people and relationships. They just happen to be leaders or kings and dukes and, you know, all of that. So we will present them, yes, to answer your question. And we're still playing about how they're going to roll out.
And then my second question, as a director and as an actor, when we have these epic speeches and monologues, how do you yourself in both situations approach that? Sam moved me to tears with that speech, and I've seen it before, and it was a different take for me. So can you talk about, speak to that from a director standpoint and an actor standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the beauty about what we get to do, really. You get to take these plays and, you know, these amazing speeches like Crispin's Day, and you look at it on the page, and then you turn on your television and you hear somebody quote, you know, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." Or you look at HBO and there's an entire mini series called Band of Brothers, and they've taken in that, you know, this notion and infused it into popular culture, into our society, and especially with the military and what that means about people coming together to fight. And you look at that and you go, it's just a massive kind of, you know, how you present that in the moment can sometimes be daunting and overwhelming. It's like To Be or Not to Be, you know. Every actor goes, okay, I got to speak this for the first time, this speech that everybody and their dog knows, you know, and people are in the back of the house reading along with the script. Or, you know, I know productions where they've started the speech and people have called out the rest of the speech, you know. But that's also part of the joy of just getting to do them. And then when you put them in context of the overall, I think that they have even greater resonance sometimes, where you know, I know that happens for me sometimes when I see Hamlet, and because Hamlet has so many famous quotes in that play, and you go, oh yeah, that was Polonius saying that to his son, and the reason he's saying that is because of this. And then there's another level, you know, to thine own self be true, you know. You hear that phrase, but then when you know why it's being said, there's another layer there. And it's the same with this. The one thing I love about these plays and the thing about them is that they really, really mold to the individual that's doing them. And my Henry V would be completely different than your Henry V. My Henry V is completely different than Sam's Henry V, because it's about the sense of self within that. And that again goes back to my earlier comment about what this play is, you know, about believing in yourself within that role and bringing who you are into the circumstance. And so I think the initial fear you kind of get over the first time you say it, and then it becomes really about just relishing what you're saying and why you're saying it and who you're saying it to. Yeah, I think that answers your question. I think.
Yeah. Well, how much interaction did you have with Sam? How much did you want to see, and how much did you leave up to him to, like you said, fill his own personal Henry V speaking?
Yeah, the question was basically about how much of this was me infusing the stuff on Sam, or how much of it was Sam saying, I want to try this. And it's both. It's a collaboration. It's, for me, it's always about putting ideas into their head. Think about this. Think about this word you're saying here, actually, as opposed to this word. I'm trying to think of an example, actually, but there's a call, and that's my job, basically, to elevate clarity, as well as take what they're wanting to bring into it and also give them the platform to explore, to know that they can try and they're going to fail sometimes. And you know what? That's exactly why we're doing them. Go do it. Put that opinion out there. Let's try it. Let's try it. Because the worst is we go, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't add up over here. But it also might be an epiphany that you go, oh my gosh, that's the exact thing you need to play there. And let's work off of that. So it really becomes that hopefully is what's going on in every set of circumstances. My job as the director is to facilitate the actors within it so that the ensemble is telling a story, basically. And then if you can infuse picture and storytelling and sound and lighting and costumes and set around that to try to help influence some of that overarching thing, awesome. Sometimes it's the opposite. Director saying, this is the message that I want to give with the play. This is what I want to do. And so by doing that, sometimes you have to pull them along to get into that. But I think you're foolish, actually, if you put too much stuff on top of what the actors are doing, because they're the ones that are going to be doing it, So it's better to have this collaboration, to get ideas, to work off of ideas, so that it becomes a unified story, Yeah, and that's the fun part about it, really. I mean, that's the best part about being in the rehearsal room, is that you can say to him, stress this word instead of this word, and how that, one of my favorite lines in the play is when he says, we are the makers of manners, Kate, and the liberty that follows our places stops the mouth of all fine faults. And the reason I love that line is because it's a sense of a king at the end of the play who has established the idea that other people's point of view aren't going to impact who he is anymore. And that rumor and reputation aren't preceding who they are as an individual. And that's how the play starts. People mocking him. The mantra comes in. He says, you savor too much of your youth. That the reputation of him being at the tavern and all this kind of stuff precedes him as a ruler of the nation. And he holds on to that burden and that doubt and uncertainty because of that stuff. But by the end of the play, he says, no, I'm authentically living in this thing. And that in itself is going to stop people from rumor. Rumor does not matter. What matters is now, togetherness, being present to this here. So, yeah.
Harsh meeting here. I gotta stand up.
That's okay.
So who would volunteer to stand up and have their heart beating fast? Well, anyway, it all begins with a meeting. It started with a meeting, but I'll get back to that. I like the part where the children are laying dead, and King comes in and he kills a French girl.
Right.
Did y'all hear me? Anyway, there's a point when they were counting the dead, they weren't counting common people, just the higher ranking people. They equated the common people to horses laying there almost. So. Anyway, so he was really faulted for being so vain and wanting to do what he did, and there was casualties. So we have our own problems with the Middle East wars. We got the Bushes, we got Cheney, saying this is a good war, we're going to go to war, and for instance, Iraq, they went in over there and a lot of people died, then they turned around and gave it back. Yeah. And then they decided next is Libya, and they messed that up. So that whole thing was about democracy and establish, nation building and all that. So I've enjoyed your play a lot. I've been coming here
Thank you.
since 1989. I've
Appreciate
watched
that
you
very
grow
much.
up.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, the play, I mean, it's, obviously has parallels politically when you think about that. And actually the play sometimes can be categorized as, Henry himself sometimes can be categorized as Machiavellian or ruthless. And there are kind of, depending on the time when it's done, sometimes it can have two different types of receptions. That it can be a patriotic display, like when Olivier's film was done in World War II, and it was really about rallying England behind the war effort. And so much so that Olivier took out a lot of the negative aspects of the play to keep it a very pro-England sense of play. There have been other productions where Henry is very ruthless and very shrewd. And that's interesting. It's interesting that a play can do that and it can resonate at different times. So we certainly talked about conflict and the idea of a nation going into another nation to try to get what they want, and by doing that they have to go to war. And this play does have parallels with that a little bit on both sides. Yeah, I mean, yeah, yes, yeah.
I think two of the strongest moments last night for me were when Henry Hal
Mm-hmm.
exposed himself. One was after Bardolph's hanging, and at the end when he it broke his heart. You could tell, and that was just really powerful. And then when he picked up the child and wept, and then actually picked him up and carried him off, I think that was just bearing his soul. No one was around. He couldn't do it when anyone else was around. But those two little moments were so strong, and I thought really added a lot.
Thank you. I mean, the relationship with the boy is something that I really, really tapped onto too emotionally, and in part two, especially of Henry IV, because the boy is Falstaff's page that was given to Falstaff by Hal. Hal gave Falstaff this page as a joke, really. I'm going to have this little page follow you around in an effort to sort of just mock Falstaff, but also what happens through that is it also becomes synonymous and a parallel for Hal, that the boy is really Hal. Same story. In the tavern, meeting all these people, loves being with them, loves spending time with them, but then starts to debate right and wrong, and a right course of action and a wrong course of action. And the boy himself says these things: I must leave them, I must get away. And then, Hal's journey is just that. It's a sense of those people the past falling away to move forward. And it happens kind of one by one in the play. It starts with the death of Falstaff that we don't even see on stage. And Falstaff dies. They all go off to war. Bardolph is hung. Nym is later hung. We find out that the boy dies. We find out that Quickly has died. And then Pistol is left alone, basically, who says, I'm going to steal and I'm going to become a bawd and I'm going to become a survivor in this thing. And it's again that part of Hal going away, the boy that becomes a man. And it's painful. And the caring of the boy becomes, for me in many ways, just a metaphor of that, of the king shedding his former self. And the thing that I love about it is that Hal himself has tried to instill change in those individuals, and yet they are incapable of change. And that is another storytelling thing about just a medieval sensibility changing over the course from Richard II to Henry V, two completely different types of rulers. Richard II, a divine order of divine right of kings ordained from God, his uncle stealing the crown from him, and then it passing down to the son, and the son going, how do I embody that sensibility? And also Hal's acceptance of God, I think, is a big thing in this play. The ideology of something bigger than all of us getting us through. And it's something that you see also over the course of these plays, and you'll see in Henry VI too, that Hal sort of walks right in the middle of it. Richard II kind of takes advantage of it and says, I am God omnipotent, basically, I am God itself. And then there's Henry who's like, no, I'm going to kind of pull this away. And then you see Henry who's like, how can I embody both of that as a true leader embodying the ideals of God? And then you see it with his son, who becomes overly pious and goes the complete opposite direction. And Hal is like, Henry is like right in the middle of that notion. And that is in the relationship with these other people. It all comes from the sense of the humanity that happens about understanding and doing the right thing. I'm glad you feel that way. I mean, it's one of the things, you know, the death of Bardolph also, I think, is another key moment. Bardolph is hung because he stole a pax. In some versions of the play, pax is, there's a little bit of misconstrued. Some versions say a pix, and some versions say a pax. And it was just notion of the notation when they were writing the play, that it might have been a pix or it might have been a pax. A pix is a container, a vessel for the Holy Communion at a church. So it's something that holds the host. A pax is a portrait of the crucifixion of Christ that a church would have, that they would pass to its congregation to kiss, to adopt, to pray over. And it's actually something that doesn't have a whole lot of monetary value, but it has extreme symbolic value. And the fact that Bardolph steals a pax is a representation of somebody stealing from God, and how Henry has to basically is put in front of his entire camp to make a decision from someone who steals from God, essentially. And the repercussions of that. He kind of has no other choice but to execute Bardolph. He has no other choice. If he didn't, his entire camp would probably mutiny. They would not believe in him anymore. And it has to be a moment of conscious struggle. So to me, it's a very human moment in the play. And it also is about war and the casualties of war in a situation like that. And the same with the death of the boy. That was something that I wanted very sudden and very quick and kind of brutal, because right in the moment of epiphany, the boy says, I'm done with this. I'm done with this. And then they lose their life right there. That it's an examination that life is fleeting, and that to make the best of every moment that we have, because you just never know. And the impact that it has on Henry on the battlefield. He says, I was not angry since I came to France until this instant. And then he himself embodies a sense of rage by that, by killing the French prisoner. And that is actually a mistake in his ideology of warfare. But it was also a tactical move, because the French were reinforcing their men, and he needed those people that were holding the prisoners to get to the front lines. So he had to kill the prisoners. And there's a lot of debate about that in history, about what was the right and wrong decision there. I love that that is something that is a blight on him as an individual, because people have that. They make mistakes. And you see that in this. That's what makes him ultimately human. For all the right decisions he makes, he does make some wrong ones.
Hanging scene always depicted?
The question was about the hanging scene. No, it's not. In fact, when I did it, he was not hung. They just took him off stage. But I knew I wanted to have that, because again, that's a moment that is just, I felt was a visceral thing that might happen. And obviously the image in itself is just quite horrific. And I don't think there's a way to really, I mean, I think you can say it and it has some impact, but then to see that is just even more like, every time I see it, and I know he's completely safe, it takes my breath away. But also is like, wow, that's pretty intense, hopefully. But no, sometimes it just depends on the production. I do know productions where they like more modern productions where it's been shot on stage, like different types where they've executed and that kind of thing. But
well, first, we've really enjoyed watching Sam and some of the other actors continue over the last few years. That's been great. So thanks for making that happen.
Cool.
It's been really impressive. My question is about the set design.
Yeah.
When I looked in the program, it looked like blood, and I thought, oh, that's so dark, and you probably wanted it to also look like that. But I was surprised when I came to the theater and saw that it was the wax and the seal. And I just wondered what thoughts you had on that, what it means to you, and your role in designing it with the set designer.
Yeah, that's a great question. I loved our vessel that we've had, this container that we've had for all of these plays. It sort of started with the Henry IV plays, and Scott Davis, who's our set designer this season, it's his first time working here. He works a lot in Chicago, and we've been sort of watching him. And I was really excited to work with him. In Henry IV Part 1, we sort of established this scenic element that was based off of, we took the line, like bright metal on a sullen ground was the line that I sort of was ruminating in my head on the Henry IV plays. But we talked a lot about the kings, the former kings, and the past, how that influences the future, and the presence that they were always looming for Henry, because Henry IV, his whole journey is trying to escape the shadow of Richard II. The whole thing is like he's just haunted by the notion of his action of usurping the crown. So we talked about this idea of having those portraits present in Henry IV, as well as this archway that was commissioned. It's based on Westminster Hall, which is at Westminster Abbey, that was actually commissioned by Richard II, but was actually the first time that it was used was for the coronation of Henry IV. And it's also this amazing piece of architecture, wood archways, and it's absolutely beautiful. So we had that as a presence in the Henry IV plays, as well as a sort of rustic and also formal kind of kingdom, and we had a big stained glass window. When we got to this play, it was like, okay, we're going to be in a new theater for one thing. What's that going to be like? But how can we infuse elements of that into this current design? And I was really interested in the idea of Henry himself trying to cover up the past, like make his own statement of who he is as a leader, and that the sense of the past is leaving and falling away. And we just sort of talked about that a little bit with the tavern characters, that there's a sense of moving forward and future. And we started, just to talk about him putting his seal on history. And then Scott Davis sent me this remarkable photo of this art installation, and the artist is escaping me, but it was this gigantic art installation, this huge wax dais, and it was red, and it was really thick, like about yay high. And it was in this white room, and it was really compelling. You walked in this entirely white room, there's this gigantic dais made of wax, and I was like, how could that image of this like a red prominent floor became really symbolic to me about, well, many things, passion, heat, blood, fire, all of that is in the play. And then we also started talking a lot about memorializing the fallen dead. And I find that with this play and Band of Brothers and all of that, this idea that Henry himself is humble to lift up others and the losses of the people around him, that they're still present. So the original design had a ton of candles actually along the back wall, and it was really like walking into a church essentially and seeing a bunch of visual candles to memorialize the dead. And we started talking, we had to cut a lot of that because of budget. But then we started talking about this sort of toppled idea, him kind of whitewashing over the past, as well as these candles prominent on the inner above that would create this sort of seal and this wax. And then it became metaphoric for everything. It looks like blood, it looks like wax, and I love it. And then we just sort of started talking about that, but also that the presence of those kings are still there a little bit, but they're a little bit farther in the background. And then now Henry is really in front of them. And again, putting his seal on future. And the toppled archway has a sense of that also, a sort of toppled arch. In the midst of the chaos and a little bit of the uncertainty comes a great statement.
With the toppled arch thing, I almost expected at the beginning of Act 2 that it would be leveled. Or at the end,
yes.
At the end that it was, but
it would
wasn't.
fly through the roof.
Well, and it was supposed to reflect some sort of stability that he established, but
Yeah.
he really didn't. Or the stability that he established lasted a few years, so it was perfect that it didn't change.
Yeah, that's good. That's cool. Yeah, I agree. I mean,
and then just this is a minor point, but for French speakers, it was a major one. Her French was awesome.
Oh, good.
Her French was very good, and in the past, that hasn't always been the case. I know most people don't care, but in the past, when you listen to somebody who's supposed to not be able to speak English, and you hear somebody who is clearly speaking American French,
right.
It's terrible. And she was great. In fact, she was so good. When she got going fast, I couldn't even follow her, and I speak French. So anyway, that was really well done. And then
I'll tell them, actually. They will be very happy to hear that.
And then his French, Sam's French, was
so bad.
Perfectly terrible. Yes, as it should
Yeah.
have been. One thought about the Henry VI plays. Most of us here, even those of us who have been coming for 38 years, have never seen the Henry VI plays. The closest we've come is when we saw War of the Roses here, which was great. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, this is going to be a disappointment. Somebody's taken the Henry VI plays and combined them into one, and it was awesome. And it occurs to me, now we have more space to fill because we've got more seats in the Engelstadt than we did in the Adams. And people who aren't Shakespeare collector people like us are going to say, who the heck was Henry VI? Why do I want to go to that? They even told me they're lousy plays. So it occurs to me, maybe you want to do them in the, maybe you want to, I mean, one of you told us, probably Fred told us 100 years ago how lousy all those plays are. So maybe you want to do them in the Ains, where you don't have to fill a big space and have a huge budget. Just a thought. Just a thought.
Stay tuned. Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning.
They're not bad plays. They're just not. They're just hard. Henry VI Part 1 is hard. Some of them are really awesome, though. I mean, like I do think that they're really compelling and really interesting, and there's some amazing characters. I mean, Margaret is an unbelievable character in that series. Joan of Arc, you know, all the female characters, of course, they're usually stronger than a lot of the male characters. Shakespeare knew he was writing for the Queen.
Good morning. Wanted to take a moment to thank you for one of the great theater experiences of my life. Last night, every 2 or 3 years, there's a production that I realize, for me anyway, is going to be the Utah Shakespeare Legend. In 2013, it was The Tempest, the best I've ever seen, and I've seen some great ones. And then last time with Henry V, rather. I'll add that to my list of Utah Shakespeare Legends, and I've seen some awfully good ones, including yours.
Thank you.
As well. But anyway, I was reminded last night why I come to theater, why it's such a all-encompassing life experience for me. It's part of the reason I live. And in any case, last night reminded me of that, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
When I reread the play, I was conscious of the thread in Henry's speech when he spoke about the consequences of war and what would happen if the shoe dropped and war was going to happen. And I found myself thinking of President Kennedy when he conferred with generals that told him, if we launch a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union now, we'll be able to kill this many millions, and their counterattack will only kill 20 million of ours, something like that. And President Kennedy left that particular meeting basically yelling, "Those people are crazy." And anyway, when I was reading Henry V, I found myself thinking of President Kennedy in that situation. And the play resonates in a modern way because presidents have to make those kinds of decisions about going to war, and we haven't always had presidents who have made that decision as insightfully and carefully and humanely as Henry is presented as making the decision in this play. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of debate if it's a pro-war and anti-war play, and I think it's an anti-war play. Actually, I think that's what Shakespeare was saying. This is an anti-war thing, even though it is a victory at the end. But I do think within that he's saying, what are the repercussions of that? In this case, though, however, it does unify a nation, and Henry IV says to his son on his deathbed, busy, giddy minds with foreign quarrels. That action will basically remove the history of the former days, and it will wash away the thing. And I think that kind of sticks in Henry's mind about trying to keep people behind a cause. But in many ways, he has no other choice because he was fraught with factions attacking him left and right. And there's there are some things, actually, we trimmed a little bit in our play with the Scottish Rebellion and the Irish Rebellion, obviously, that was going on in Elizabethan England at the time. So there's some parallels with that. But I do think Shakespeare is weaving in a sort of anti-war play when we get into the descriptions of what happens within the battle and all of that, and the numbers of the dead, and the French saying, that they've made people lords so that they'll go fight. They were dubbed knights, basically. And then, the sense of God in the play is something that the word God in this play is used so many times. It's something like 60 some odd times, I think. It tells you that, Shakespeare's taking a character and putting a moral question at play within this set of circumstances. And that obviously is very current.
I'd second that about this beautiful play. And we were surprised that the house was only about 2/3 full. That was disappointing.
Yeah.
Preview week.
Yeah.
It's a preview, but nonetheless.
So get the word out so people can see it.
Can I interrupt you and say, then why did you choose Henry V?
Why did we choose it?
Yes.
Other than the fact that we come here every year and see everything? Well, I've always thought that Henry V is like one of the plays that you had to see. And so that's why it was surprising to me that it was unseen by so many people. And yet it's so important. But my question has to do with that period of time when you have the four Brits in conversation, the Scot, the Irishman, which I gather is the only Irishman in all of
Shakespeare.
All of Shakespeare. And then the Englishman, Gower, and then Llewellyn. And Llewellyn has a large part. He keeps going for a long, long time. My specific question is, don't take this as an insult, but the Irishman clearly did an Irish accent. The Scotsman clearly did a over-the-top Scot. Llewellyn was sort of a Scots light. And I'm just wondering if the reason you didn't have someone do a Welsh accent is that it's very hard to find an actor who can do a Welsh accent, because that wasn't.
It is a challenging dialect. I will say that he's doing his best attempt at a Welsh dialect.
Scots light is about the best you can do.
I mean, it's also the interesting thing about Llewellyn and the way it's written also is that it's the way it's written actually is written to pronounce those words, which is actually unlike a lot of other characters that are written that way. Like peeing in his ales and cups. That's one where he means to say being in his ales and cups. It's actually written as peeing in his ales and cups. Things like that in the folio, when you look at it, written in the folio about how it was spelled out.
And a lot of that is kind of making fun of the Welsh as backwoods hinterland type people who simply can't pronounce things.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that Shakespeare does great in this play, I mean, I think that scene is actually very important in the play because it shows these four elements of England that will come together by the end of this thing. Scots, Irish, Welsh, and English. Four representations, four nations there. And in Shakespeare's time, I also think it would have been quite humorous, obviously, to have this Irish character say, there's no work to be done. The other thing is that actor is actually a Scottish actor. Jack Lafferty is Scottish. He is from Scotland, of Scottish descent. When I called him, I was like, I'm having you play an Irishman. Can you do the dialect? And he was like, I would look forward to doing that. But we talked a lot about that, about the sense of pride of each nation. And the thing that I think is beautiful about that is each one of those guys hold fast to their own beliefs within this thing. And by the end of it, they all start fighting under the same banner for the same kingdom, the same person, the same king. And it does become about unifying these four regions behind one sense of being. And while it is kind of a comic scene about the strategies of warfare within that, that's what that whole debate really is. They do come together. And it also establishes that there's conflict within his camp, even also, that people are still fighting for the same cause. And yet, as Bates says, be friends, you English fools, be friends. We have French quarrels enough. You cannot have dissension within the ranks. We need to come together as a group, as a unity, as an ensemble in the theatrical terms. But so all that is very present in the play. And I also think the Welsh light is also for clarity's sake, really, because he does have a lot of language in the play. And he also is the philosopher in the sense about warfare. He also talks a great deal about fortune and fortune's fickle wheel, that you can be on the upswing of it at one moment and then the downswing of it at another. And fate, and how fate and fortune sometimes play a hand in the overarching scheme of the military. And that sometimes luck. And I'll tell you, that's kind of what happened historically with the English. They were completely outnumbered, 5-1 going into the Battle of Agincourt. Weary, they walked for miles previous. They were kept at the Battle of Harfleur for like a month, hunkered down. They had to walk up the river. They could not find a crossing to the other side, and finally found a passing, a bridge that took them to the other side. They were entrenched, encamped, and they were outnumbered and outflanked. And the night before the battle, it rained immensely over the field, and rained and rained and rained and rained. The two things that were their sense that were strategic and helpful for the English victory were, one, the English longbow, which was the archers that could shoot these arrows and pierce the French, and also that the French had so much armor that they were wearing that they were actually drowned on the battlefield. They were plugged down in the mud and could not fight. And it actually worked to great effect for the English. And I think that Shakespeare knew that, and that was historical, that there was something at play greater than the numbers and the strength. And that's what Shakespeare says with God fought for us. And it is a huge military victory. It's sort of regarded as one of the great miracles of warfare, and obviously in English history. You know, this sign, actually, this peace sign, actually was the English longbow at the end of the Battle of Agincourt, holding up their fingers to show that their fingers were not cut off in battle. That's what they did, was they would cut off the fingers of the English longbow so that they couldn't draw their strings. That this became a symbol of victory, as well as the fact that they were still alive, which came from the Battle of Agincourt.
Final comment?
Just, yeah, one question before we go on. Could you comment on Henry being the voice of the people, because he came from the dregs of society, as it were, the bars and so forth, and he knew the people.
He did, yeah. I mean, historically, you know, there is some, you know, some of that is, I think, sort of history, and also Shakespeare taking Holinshed and sort of weaving some of that into the historical account of Prince Hal into the storytelling of these 3 plays. But actually, Prince Hal was actually a page to Richard II, actually, and knew him. So kind of grew up with him and was actually in a lot of military stuff. He wasn't necessarily always off gallivanting and all that. He did have some military influence in his life during his father's campaign, but he was not as present as like his brothers in Bedford. And but I think what Shakespeare is weaving in the storytelling of showing this guy over 3 plays is to show that by his going into the tavern and meeting Falstaff and really having a surrogate father in Falstaff, he starts to embody 2 sensibilities. One of the people in the communion of life and the celebration of people on a different social status, and then also of him bouncing into the court world and trying to infuse some of that ideology into his own sense of self. And that, again, goes back to that thing about using all the things that make us who we are, how your history, your past, your relationships infuse everything that's moving forward. And that is an epiphany in the play for him about other people. Other people are the thing that do this. That's where he says in the Upon the King's speech, it's not about ceremony, it's not about all this stuff. And he says the wretched slave who with a body filled and vacant mind gets him to rest. And then he, next day after dawn, helps Hyperion to his horse and follows so the ever running year with profitable labor to his grave. And then, but for ceremony, what is ceremony? Nothing, just a tangible nothing. It's about the people that are doing it. And that comes from a king that is quite different from some of the other kings that we see. This king is actually on the front lines of the battlefield also. And this debate about ransoming him is actually a huge thing in the play. That they say, I can ransom him. I myself won't be ransomed. I won't be ransomed. I'm going to fight. He has to let others believe that he is like them. And that's a journey that he goes on. And it's only, and I think the only reason he comes to that epiphany is because of his past and the people that he met in his past. Being able to see and talk and know them, as well as debate right and wrong and justice and peace and all this stuff that infuses a sense of leadership in who he is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian Vaughn, for wonderful. Thank you to all of you for being here this morning.